Many Democrats and opponents of Trump, of course, are putting Roe v. Wade right at the top of the list of things that will now be reversed if Kavanaugh is seated. That's what Trump had promised repeatedly during the campaign. I see no reason to believe it won't happen. And as you wrote last night at Slate, that's not just what could happen if he's confirmed, but will almost certainly happen. You describe how, as a member of the D.C. Circuit Court, Kavanaugh actually offered a roadmap for overturning Roe in this case of this 17-year-old girl, this undocumented immigrant minor who was being held in detention by the Trump administration just last year in 2017, and they were trying to prevent her from receiving an abortion. How did Kavanaugh's opinions in that case offer the roadmap for essentially overturning Roe as you see it?
So Kavanaugh basically laid out for everyone to see precisely how the courts and the Supreme Court can hollow out Roe to the point of meaninglessness without actually acknowledging what it's doing. So under current Supreme Court precedent, an abortion restriction is unconstitutional if it's an undue burden on a woman's right to abortion access. That's the standard, an undue burden. Mm-hmm. And I think quite reasonably in this case, the ACLU said, look, the Trump administration is barring this 17-year-old girl from getting an abortion at all. That is an absolute ban on her right to choose. Surely that counts as an undue burden. The Trump administration responded by saying, well, no, if she wants an abortion, she should just self-deport back to her home country, where, by the way, abortion is illegal. And Kavanaugh, who sat on the three-judge panel that first adjudicated this dispute, he reached this bizarre compromise where he would have let the government force this poor girl to remain pregnant for at least 2 more weeks so that she could try to find a sponsor, so a family member in the country who would take her into their custody, and then the government would no longer be able to control her abortion decision. But he also wrote, if at the end of these 2 weeks she hasn't found a sponsor, she does not have a guaranteed right to abortion access. She will just have to start over at the beginning of this litigation and try again. Here's the problem there. She was already 16 weeks pregnant when Kavanaugh issued this ruling. She was living in Texas, where abortion is banned at 20 weeks. And every week into her unwanted pregnancy, the eventual abortion procedure became riskier and riskier. So Kavanaugh was saying that it was not an undue burden on this poor girl to force her to continue carrying an unwanted second trimester pregnancy for at least 2 more weeks, right up to the point that it would be literally illegal for her to terminate the pregnancy, basically because to Kavanaugh, an undue burden means nothing. So that, I think, is where the court will go in this direction to say, oh, well, undue burden, that's just such a malleable standard that will allow any kind of abortion restriction and just say that's not an undue burden because we say so.
So they'll just basically, this is a roadmap to essentially chip away, make it harder and harder and harder until it's essentially impossible to obtain this constitutional right, even if they don't overturn it outright. It seems to be the argument you're making here.
That's exactly right. You know, if the court comes out and says, we hereby overturn Roe versus Wade, then they're going to incur a massive political blowback that will probably sweep Democrats into power. But if the court just hollows out Roe, doesn't admit what it's doing, but continues to rule horribly in cases like this undocumented minor case and say, well, that's not an undue burden and that's not an undue burden, then it can make Roe meaningless, essentially abolish Roe and the constitutional right to an abortion while maintaining political cover. I think Kavanaugh was chosen to fill that role. He will be very adept at it. He will help guide the court out of its abortion rights jurisprudence and do so in a disingenuous way that keeps political backlash at a minimum.